Good evening, dear friends. I hope you found yourself in a comfortable spot tonight. Perhaps you're nestled beneath your softest blanket, the day's worries slowly melting away like morning frost in gentle sunlight. Dim those lights if you haven't already. Let your shoulders relax and allow yourself to settle into this peaceful moment we're about to share. Before we begin this soothing journey through history, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a cozy bedroom with rain pattering softly against the window? Maybe you're in a quiet living room where the only sound is the gentle hum of evening settling in. Please tell me in the comments below and share what helps you unwind after a long day. If this content brings you the peace and relaxation you're seeking, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to join our tranquil community. A gentle like would mean the world to me. And if you have suggestions for future stories that might help you find rest, please leave them in the comments. Your thoughts and presence here create this peaceful space we all share. Tonight, we're going to drift back through the mists of time to a period when cherry blossoms fell like gentle snow across ancient Japan. We'll walk alongside a remarkable soul whose story has been whispered through centuries. A tale not of violence, but of profound transformation, inner mastery, and the quiet strength that comes from truly knowing oneself. Our journey begins in the year 1584, in a small village tucked away in the rolling hills of Japan, where the air carried the scent of pine and distant mountains. This was during what historians call the Sengoku period, a time when the country was like a restless sea, with waves of change washing over every province and village. But don't worry about the complexities of that distant world. Instead, let's focus on something much simpler and more peaceful. The story of a child who would grow to understand the deepest truths about strength, wisdom, and the gentle art of living fully. In a modest home in the village of Miyamoto, nestled among terraced fields and whispering bamboo groves, a baby was born who would one day be known as Miyamoto Musashi. Imagine, if you will, that small village as the sun sets, casting everything in golden light. The mountains stand like gentle guardians in the distance, and smoke rises peacefully from cooking fires. Children play quietly in the dusty streets, and somewhere in the gentle evening air, the sound of a temple bell carries on the wind. The baby's father, Shinmen Munisai, was a man skilled in the way of the sword, but more importantly for our story, he was someone who understood that true strength comes from discipline, not the harsh, angry kind, but the patient, steady discipline of someone tending a garden or watching clouds drift across an endless sky. In those days, fathers often taught their sons through gentle repetition and quiet example, the way morning light gradually brightens a room without anyone noticing the exact moment darkness gives way to day. As this child grew from a baby into a small boy, there was something wonderfully wild and free about him. He wasn't the sort to sit quietly memorizing lessons or bowing politely when visitors came. Instead, he was drawn to the outdoors, to the feeling of grass beneath his feet, the sound of wind through leaves, and the endless fascination of watching how water finds its way around stones in a stream. Can you picture him? A small figure with dark hair catching the light, running through fields with the boundless energy that only children possess, his laughter mixing with birdsong in the warm afternoon air. Even as a young boy, there was something different about him. Not in a troubling way, but in the way that some children seem to carry an old soul, as if they're listening to music the rest of us can't quite hear. He would spend hours watching how shadows moved across the ground, or how his own breath created small clouds in the cold morning air. There was a quality of attention in him, a way of being completely present in each moment that most people never learn, no matter how long they live. The village itself was a place of gentle rhythms. Farmers rising before dawn to tend their rice fields, craftsmen working wood and clay with patient hands, mothers singing soft lullabies that seemed to blend with the evening breeze. And in this peaceful setting, young Musashi learned his first lessons about life, not from books or formal instruction, but from simply being awake to the world around him, breathing it in like the sweetest air. So tonight, as you settle deeper into comfort, let yourself imagine that distant village, those peaceful fields, and a young boy who was already, without knowing it, beginning a journey that would teach him and eventually teach all of us about the quiet power that comes from truly mastering oneself. As our young Musashi grew taller, like a sapling reaching toward gentle sunlight, his world expanded beyond the village square and familiar garden paths. Picture those early morning hours when the world is still soft with dew, when even the birds sing more quietly, as if respecting the peace of dawn. It was during these hushed times that his father began sharing with him the ancient ways of the sword. But let me paint this scene differently than you might imagine. This wasn't harsh training with shouting and rigid discipline. Instead, think of it like learning to dance with shadows. Slow, patient movements that flowed like water finding its natural course down a hillside. Father and son would stand together in a small clearing behind their home, surrounded by tall grass that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The wooden practice swords they held caught the early light, and their movements were more like meditation than combat. Munisai understood something beautiful about teaching. He knew that the mind learns best when it's relaxed, when knowledge can seep in slowly like rain into thirsty earth. So their practice sessions had a dreamy quality, long moments of stillness punctuated by graceful, deliberate movements. The boy would watch his father's form with the kind of complete attention the children give to things that truly captivate them, the way they might watch snow falling or follow the path of a butterfly through summer air. Between these gentle lessons, young Musashi would wander the countryside surrounding his village. These solitary walks became a kind of education all their own. He'd follow deer paths through quiet forests, where ancient trees filtered sunlight into pools of gold and green. He learned to move silently through tall grass, not to hunt or harm, but simply to feel what it was like to be part of the natural world around him. Sometimes he'd sit perfectly still beside a stream, watching how water carved its patient way around stones, never fighting, never forcing, just persistently, gently finding the path of least resistance. Can you feel yourself there with him? The soft earth beneath you, the whisper of wind through leaves overhead, the distant sound of water moving over smooth rocks? This was where he began to understand something that would guide him for the rest of his life, that true strength isn't loud or aggressive, but quiet, steady, and deeply rooted like an old tree that bends with storms but never breaks. During the longer summer evenings, when the cicadas sang their drowsy songs and fireflies began their gentle dance, the village would settle into that peaceful rhythm that seems to exist only in such quiet places. Neighbors would gather on wooden porches to share simple meals and quiet conversation. Children would play games that required no equipment except imagination. Shadow puppets on walls, stories told in whispers, contests to see who could sit the most still. It was during one of these serene evenings that young Musashi first heard the older villagers speak in hushed tones about the wider world beyond their hills.
They told stories of great swordsmen who moved like wind across water, of masters who could defeat opponents through the sheer clarity of their presence rather than the sharpness of their blades. These weren't tales of violence or conquest, but something much more mysterious and beautiful. Stories of men who had found a way to live in perfect harmony with the natural flow of existence. As he listened to these gentle stories while lying on his back looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch, the boy began to sense that there was something vast and wonderful waiting for him beyond the familiar boundaries of his village life. Not something to be grasped or conquered, but something to be discovered as naturally as morning discovers the mountains, as naturally as rivers discover the sea. His training continued through the seasons, through spring rains that drummed softly on their roof, through the long golden afternoons of summer when the air shimmered with heat and possibility, through autumn days when leaves fell like wishes and the world seemed painted in shades of fire and amber. And always there was that quality of gentleness to his learning, that sense of growing into something rather than being forced into a mold. By the time snow began to dust the mountain peaks visible from their village, young Musashi had absorbed something essential that would stay with him always: the understanding that true mastery comes not from fighting against the world, but from learning to move with it, like a leaf carried on water, finding its natural course downstream towards something beautiful and unknown.
As winter settled over the village like a soft blanket of snow, 13-year-old Musashi found himself at the threshold of a moment that would whisper his name into history. But let's not think of this as a dramatic turning point, filled with clash and thunder. Instead, imagine it more like the way dawn breaks, so gradually that you can't pinpoint the exact moment night becomes day, yet everything is transformed. The traveling swordsman who arrived in their village that winter came not as a conqueror or boastful warrior, but more like a teacher who had lost his way. His name was Arima Kihei, and he carried himself with the kind of weariness that comes from walking too many roads and winning too many hollow victories. Perhaps he was searching for something, a worthy student, a glimpse of pure technique, or simply a warm place to rest during the cold months. On the evening when word spread through the village that this stranger might accept a friendly match, the air held that special quality of anticipation that feels more like excitement than fear. Picture the scene: snow falling gently outside, warm light spilling from windows, and neighbors gathering quietly to witness what they expected would be a brief lesson in humility for their wild young boy. But Musashi himself felt no anxiety, no desperate need to prove anything. Instead, there was something remarkably peaceful about his preparation. He spent the morning in quiet meditation, sitting in his favorite spot beside the stream that ran behind their home. Even though it was winter, the water still moved with that same patient persistence he had watched through so many seasons. The sound was different now, softer, more muffled by ice and snow, but the essential quality remained unchanged. Water always finds its way. When the time came for the encounter, both participants bowed with genuine respect. This wasn't about ego or dominance, but about the ancient dance between teacher and student, experience and intuition, age and youth. Arima Kihei drew his sword with the practiced grace of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The steel caught the last light of the winter afternoon, creating brief flashes that seemed to hang in the cold air like frozen moments. Musashi held only a wooden sword, a practice blade worn smooth by years of patient training. In his hands, it felt alive, warm despite the winter cold, perfectly balanced like everything in his world had led to this single moment. But here's what made this encounter beautiful rather than violent. It lasted only as long as a single breath, a heartbeat, the time it takes for a snowflake to land and disappear. There was no struggle, no lengthy battle. Instead, it was more like watching a master calligrapher complete a single, perfect brushstroke. Musashi moved with such natural, flowing motion that even the watching villagers barely understood what they had seen. One moment, two figures faced each other in the snow. The next, the traveling swordsman was sitting in the snow, looking more surprised than hurt, while their young neighbor stood quietly, his wooden sword resting calmly at his side. What followed wasn't celebration or boasting. Instead, there was a quality of deep stillness, as if everyone present had witnessed something sacred. Arima Kihei slowly rose to his feet, brushed the snow from his clothes, and bowed deeply, not in defeat, but in recognition. He had come to the village as a teacher and found himself a student. In that moment of quiet acknowledgement, something beautiful passed between the older man and the boy. The understanding that true strength has nothing to do with forcing others down, but everything to do with lifting everyone up. The villagers dispersed quietly, speaking in hushed tones that seemed appropriate for the moment. Snow continued to fall, covering the disturbed ground where the brief encounter had taken place, making everything clean and new again. By evening, it was as if nothing had happened, except that everything had changed. That night, as Musashi sat by the fire in his family's home, listening to the wind sing through the eaves and watching shadows dance on the walls, he felt something new stirring within him. Not ambition exactly, or pride, but more like recognition, as if he had glimpsed his reflection in still water and seen for the first time who he truly was beneath all the surface ripples. His father said little about what had transpired, but there was a new quality in the way he looked at his son. Not surprise, but a kind of gentle acknowledgement, like a gardener who has watched a seed grow into something beautiful and is finally seeing the first flowers bloom.
2 years drifted by like leaves floating downstream, each season bringing its own quiet teachings. Spring brought the soft green of new bamboo shoots and the gentle sound of rain on the wooden roof. Summer brought long, drowsy afternoons when the air shimmered with heat and cicadas sang their endless song. Autumn painted the mountain slopes in colors so beautiful they seemed almost like dreams, and winter returned with its gift of stillness and reflection. Through all these seasons, 15-year-old Musashi continued his training, but now there was something different about it. A quality of listening, as if he were trying to hear a distant melody that only he could detect. He spent more and more time alone, walking the mountain paths that wound through forest where ancient trees stood like gentle guardians, their branches creating cathedral spaces filled with filtered light and whispering leaves. It was during one of these solitary walks, when spring was just beginning to touch the mountain with the first tiny wildflowers, that Musashi came to understand something important. The village that had been his whole world suddenly felt like a beautiful room he had outgrown. Not because it wasn't lovely, but because his spirit needed more space to breathe, more paths to explore, more questions to discover. The decision to leave came to him not as a dramatic revelation, but more like the way morning gradually brightens the sky. There was no single moment when he decided to go. Instead, the knowing settled into his heart slowly, naturally, like sediment settling to the bottom of a clear mountain pool. He would become what they called a ronin, a masterless samurai, free to walk whatever path called to him. The evening before his departure, he sat with his father beside the stream where he had spent so many peaceful hours. The water moved past them with its eternal patience, carrying fallen leaves and flower petals toward distant rivers and eventually the great ocean that embraced all waters. Father and son didn't speak much. There was no need for many words. They both understood that this leaving was as natural as a river flowing toward the sea, as inevitable as spring following winter. "The path you're choosing," his father said softly, his voice nearly lost in the sound of moving water, is not an easy one. You'll have no lord to serve, no guaranteed meals, no warm bed waiting for you each evening. Musashi nodded, watching how the moonlight created silver patterns on the water's surface. I know, father. But I think the path that calls to me isn't meant to be easy. It's meant to be true. They sat in comfortable silence after that, two figures beside the eternal stream, each lost in his own thoughts, but connected by something deeper than words. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called softly, and an owl answered from another direction. The sound seemed to weave through the darkness like a gentle conversation, natural and unhurried. When morning came, Musashi prepared for his journey with the same quiet deliberation he brought to everything else. He packed only what he truly needed: a spare set of clothes, his swords, a small pouch of rice, and a few coins his father had saved over the years. Everything fit into a simple bundle that he could carry easily on his back. The farewell was gentle, without tears or dramatic speeches. His father placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said simply, "Remember what the water taught you." Musashi bowed deeply, understanding that this blessing contained all the wisdom he needed for the journey ahead. As he walked away from the village, following the path that led into the mountains and toward the wider world beyond, he didn't look back. Not because he didn't love his home, but because he knew it would always be with him, in the sound of wind through leaves, in the patience of moving water, in the deep stillness he carried within himself like a hidden treasure. The morning was cool and bright, with that quality of light that makes everything seem possible. Birds sang from the forest on either side of the path, and somewhere ahead the road curved around a bend where he couldn't see what waited. But instead of feeling anxious about the unknown, Musashi felt a deep sense of rightness, as if he were a river that had finally found its proper course toward the sea. Behind him, the village continued its gentle rhythm. Farmers tending their fields, craftsmen working at their benches, children playing their eternal games. And ahead of him stretched an endless network of paths, each one offering its own lessons, its own opportunities for growth and understanding. He was 16 years old, masterless, free, and completely at peace with the choice he had made.
The first few weeks of Musashi's journey unfolded like a slow, beautiful dream. Each morning, he would wake wherever the previous evening had found him, sometimes beneath the wide, protective branches of an ancient pine, sometimes in a small clearing carpeted with soft moss. Occasionally, in the corner of a village shrine where weary travelers were always welcome. There's something magical about waking up in a different place each morning, something that gradually changes the way you see the world. When your bed is the earth itself and your ceiling is the endless sky, you begin to notice things that people living in houses might overlook. The way dew forms perfect circles on spider webs, creating tiny galaxies in the grass. The soft sound of your own breathing mixing with the gentle symphony of birds greeting the dawn. The gradual way light creeps across the landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and rose before settling into the clear, honest colors of day. Musashi's routine was simple and peaceful. He would rise early when the air was still cool and sweet, and spend a few minutes in quiet meditation, just listening to the world wake up around him. Then he would walk, following paths that seemed to choose themselves, stopping whenever something caught his attention, a particularly beautiful view, an interesting rock formation, or simply a comfortable place to rest and think. His appearance gradually changed during these wandering weeks. The careful grooming expected of someone from a respectable family gave way to something more natural and wild. His hair grew longer, often tied back with whatever bit of cord he could find. His clothes became weathered and practical, marked by sun and rain and the thousand small encounters with the natural world. But there was nothing shabby about this transformation. Instead, he looked like someone who belonged outdoors, as comfortable in the wilderness as a deer or a hawk. The dojo visits began almost by accident. He would arrive in a town looking for a simple meal or a place to sleep, and someone would inevitably notice the swords he carried. Word would spread quietly.
There's a young Ronin in town. He looks interesting." Before long, someone from the local martial arts school would approach him, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with challenge, often with a mixture of both. These encounters had a quality quite different from what you might expect. They were less like battles and more like conversations conducted with swords instead of words. Musashi would arrive at the appointed place with no fanfare, no boasting, no attempt to intimidate. He would simply be present, completely and naturally, the way a tree is present in a forest, or a stone is present in a stream. When the actual sparring began, something remarkable would happen. Instead of trying to overpower his opponents or show off complex techniques, Musashi would seem to disappear into the rhythm of the encounter itself. He moved like water, adapting to the shape of its container, like wind finding the spaces between leaves. His responses came not from pre-planned strategy, but from a kind of deep listening, as if he could hear what his opponent was going to do before they decided to do it themselves. The results of these peaceful encounters were consistent. Musashi would win, but in such a way that his opponents often felt they had learned something valuable rather than simply been defeated. There was no humiliation, no crushing of spirits. Instead, there was a quality of teaching, as if each match revealed something beautiful about the nature of movement, timing, and awareness itself. Between these visits to various dojos, Musashi would return to his wandering, to the quiet education that the road itself provided. He learned to read weather and the behavior of birds, to find water by following animal paths, to sense the mood of a village before entering it. He discovered that every region had its own dialect, not just of language, but of gesture, custom, and rhythm. Most importantly, he began to understand that mastery was not a destination, but a way of traveling. Each encounter, each walk through unknown forests, each night spent under unfamiliar stars added another layer to his understanding. He was not trying to become someone else. He was slowly, patiently, discovering who he already was beneath all the assumptions and expectations he had carried from his village life. The sword techniques he developed during this period had the same quality as his wandering itself: fluid, adaptable, rooted in careful observation rather than rigid tradition. Like a river that carves its own course through the landscape, Musashi was allowing his unique path to emerge naturally from his encounters with the world. As months flowed into years like a gentle stream winding toward the ocean, Musashi's reputation began to spread in the quiet way that truly meaningful things often do. Not through loud proclamations or dramatic gestures, but through whispered conversations between fellow travelers, through stories shared around evening fires, through the kind of word of mouth that carries only the most essential truths. He was becoming known not as a fierce warrior who crushed opponents, but as something more mysterious and beautiful. A swordsman who seemed to understand the secret language that exists between intention and action, between the moment of decision and the movement that follows. People began to describe his dueling style with words usually reserved for natural phenomena: flowing like water, swift like wind, inevitable like the changing seasons. During this period of gentle wandering, Musashi discovered something that would transform his approach to swordsmanship forever. It happened during a particularly peaceful evening when he was camped beside a mountain lake so still it perfectly mirrored the stars above. As he sat in meditation, watching the way his breath created small clouds in the cool air, he found himself thinking about the nature of balance itself. He began to experiment with holding two wooden practice swords simultaneously, one in each hand. At first, it felt awkward and unnatural, like trying to write with both hands at once, or attempting to carry on two conversations simultaneously.
But Musashi had learned patience from his years of wandering, and he approached this new challenge with the same gentle persistence with which he approached everything else. Night after night, beside whatever fire or stream or sheltered grove had welcomed him for the evening, he would practice these dual movements. Slowly, gracefully, like someone learning a new dance, he explored how his body could accommodate two weapons, two rhythms, two flows of energy moving in harmony rather than competing with each other. The breakthrough came not through force or frustration, but through a moment of perfect relaxation. He was practicing one evening as the sun set behind distant mountains, painting the sky in colors so beautiful they seemed almost like music made visible. Suddenly, without thinking about it, his hands began to move independently, yet in perfect coordination, like a bird that doesn't think about how to fly, but simply spreads its wings and trusts the air to carry it. From that moment forward, his two-sword technique, which would later be called Nitenichiru, or the school of two swords as one, began to develop with the same organic naturalness that characterized everything else in his approach to life. He didn't force it into existence. He allowed it to emerge from his patient practice and deep listening to what his body and spirit were trying to teach him. The beauty of this new style wasn't in its complexity or showiness, but in its fundamental reasonableness. While one sword engaged an opponent's weapon, the other was free to follow whatever opening presented itself. It was like being able to speak two languages at once, or like having one hand write poetry while the other painted a picture. The movements flowed together with such natural grace that watching him practice was like watching water find its way around stones in a stream. Inevitable, effortless, beautiful. Word of this unusual technique began to spread along with his reputation. Swordsmen would travel considerable distances just to see if the stories were true. Could this quiet, young Ronin really wield two swords with equal skill? Did he really fight with such fluid naturalness that his opponents often forgot they were supposed to be adversaries? The answers, when they came, were always the same. Yes, he could. Yes, he did. But more importantly, his victories had a quality that was almost healing rather than destructive. Opponents would walk away from encounters with him feeling not defeated but somehow enlarged, as if they had glimpsed a new way of understanding what mastery could look like. Musashi himself remained largely unaffected by these growing whispers of fame. He continued his wandering with the same peaceful deliberation, the same openness to whatever lessons each new day might bring. If anything, success made him more humble rather than more proud, more curious rather than more certain. He began to understand that the two swords were really one sword, just as the two hands were really one person, just as he himself was really one small part of the vast, interconnected web of existence that included the mountains and streams, the changing seasons, the other travelers he met along the way, and the endless sky that arched above all of them with its patient, eternal presence. As Musashi's journey continued through the gentle passage of seasons, his understanding of combat began to evolve in ways that even he found surprising. What had started as a practical exploration of technique gradually deepened into something much more profound, an investigation into the very nature of conflict itself, and more importantly, how conflicts could be resolved with the least possible harm to everyone involved. He began to notice patterns in his encounters that had less to do with sword techniques and more to do with the subtle currents of emotion and intention that flowed between people. Before any blade was drawn, before any formal challenge was issued, he could sense the outcome of a potential confrontation by reading the almost invisible signs that preceded it. The way someone held tension in their shoulders when they were afraid, the slight hesitation in their voice when they weren't truly committed to their challenge, the telltale brightness in their eyes when they had already defeated themselves through anxiety or overconfidence. This awareness led him to develop what might be called a gentle approach to winning. Rather than meeting force with force, he began to find ways to redirect the energy of an encounter, much like a skilled gardener might redirect the flow of water to nourish plants rather than cause erosion. Sometimes this meant arriving deliberately late to a planned duel, not out of disrespect, but because he had learned that anxious waiting could tire an opponent more effectively than any physical technique. Other times, he would appear at the appointed place looking so completely unassuming, perhaps with his hair disheveled from sleep, or his clothes showing the honest wear of travel, that his opponent would unconsciously relax their guard. It wasn't deception exactly, but rather a kind of camouflage of ordinariness that allowed him to see people as they really were, beneath their formal preparations for conflict. His victories during this period took on an almost dreamlike quality. Observers would later struggle to describe exactly what they had witnessed, because the encounters often ended so quickly and quietly that they seemed less like battles and more like brief, graceful dances. Musashi would appear to barely move, making only the most minimal adjustments to his position or timing, yet somehow these tiny changes would create openings that decided the entire encounter. He discovered that the most effective techniques were often the most subtle ones. A slight shift of weight that threw an opponent off balance. A change in the rhythm of his breathing that disrupted their timing. A way of holding his sword that suggested one intention while preparing for another. These were not tricks or deceptions, but rather expressions of a deep understanding of how human bodies and minds naturally responded to different kinds of pressure and invitation. Between these encounters, his wandering took on an increasingly meditative quality. He would spend entire days walking forest paths where the only sounds were his own footsteps on fallen leaves and the distant conversations of birds in the canopy above. Sometimes he would sit for hours beside mountain streams, not thinking about strategy or technique, but simply watching how water found its way past obstacles. Never fighting directly against a stone, but patiently exploring every possible route around it, until it discovered the path that allowed it to continue flowing toward its destination. These periods of quiet observation began to inform his understanding of conflict in profound ways. He realized that every confrontation was really a conversation, and like any conversation, its outcome depended more on listening than on speaking. An opponent's attack was really a question, and the most effective response was not necessarily the loudest or most forceful one, but the one that most clearly understood what was actually being asked. This insight led him to develop what could only be described as a compassionate approach to combat. He began to see his opponents not as enemies to be destroyed, but as fellow travelers who had somehow lost their way and were expressing their confusion through aggression. His role was not to punish them for this confusion, but to help them find their way back to clarity, sometimes through a gentle demonstration of superior technique, sometimes through a brief moment of shared understanding that transcended the artificial boundaries created by formal dueling. The most remarkable aspect of these encounters was how often they ended with mutual respect rather than humiliation. Opponents would bow to Musashi not just out of formal courtesy, but with genuine gratitude, as if they had received a teaching rather than simply experienced a defeat. Word of these unusual conclusions began to spread along with his reputation, creating a kind of legend that was as much about wisdom as it was about martial skill. In the quieter moments between his encounters, those peaceful interludes when he would find himself alone on mountain paths or resting beside gurgling streams, Musashi began to explore territories of understanding that extended far beyond the realm of swordsmanship. It was as if his growing mastery of combat had opened doorways in his mind that led to larger questions about the nature of mastery itself. He discovered that the same principles that governed effective sword work seemed to apply to every aspect of life. The importance of timing, for instance, was not just relevant to the moment when a blade should be drawn or a strike should be delivered. Timing mattered when deciding which path to take through unknown territory, when to approach a village and when to camp in the wilderness.
when to speak during conversations with fellow travelers, and when to remain silent and simply listen. Balance, too, revealed itself as a universal principle. Physical balance was essential in combat, certainly, but Musashi began to recognize that mental and emotional balance were equally crucial. The calm center he had learned to maintain during the intensity of a duel proved to be just as valuable when facing the loneliness of long solitary journeys, the uncertainty of not knowing where his next meal would come from, or the quiet sadness that sometimes arose when he thought about the village and family he had left behind. During this period of deepening understanding, his artistic pursuits began to flourish in ways that surprised even him. What had started as simple sketching to pass quiet evening hours gradually evolved into a serious exploration of brush painting, calligraphy, and wood carving. He found that the same focused attention he brought to reading an opponent's intentions could be applied to observing the way light fell across a landscape, the graceful curve of a bird in flight, or the subtle variations in texture that made each piece of wood unique and beautiful. His first serious paintings were created beside campfires, using brushes he carved himself from bamboo and ink he mixed from charcoal and stream water. The subjects were simple: a single branch with a few leaves, a rock formation that had caught his eye during the day's travel, the reflection of clouds in a still pond. But there was something about these humble works that seemed to capture not just the appearance of their subjects, but something deeper, their essential spirit, their quiet dignity, their perfect belonging in the world exactly as they were. Fellow travelers who encountered him during this period often remarked on the apparent contradiction between his reputation as a formidable swordsman and the gentle absorption with which he would paint or carve during the evening hours. But Musashi himself experienced no contradiction at all. To him, the brush and the sword were simply two different tools for engaging with the same fundamental reality, the endless, ever-changing dance of forces and forms that made up the world around him. His calligraphy, in particular, began to develop a distinctive style that seemed to embody the same flowing naturalness that characterized his sword work. Each character would emerge from his brush like a small, perfect movement, economical, graceful, and somehow alive with its own quiet energy. He would practice writing the same word dozens of times, not to achieve mechanical perfection, but to discover what that particular word wanted to look like when it was expressed with complete honesty and presence. Poetry, too, began to flow from his brush during these contemplative hours. His verses were typically brief and unadorned, more like distilled observations than elaborate compositions. They captured fleeting moments, the sound of rain on tent fabric, the sight of morning mist rising from a valley, the feeling of being completely alone under a vast sky filled with stars, and somehow made these ordinary experiences feel profound and significant. What united all of these artistic explorations was the same quality that informed his approach to swordsmanship, a deep respect for the inherent nature of his materials and subjects, combined with a willingness to let his own ego step aside and allow something larger to express itself through his hands. Whether he was wielding a sword or a brush, carving wood or composing a poem, the goal was never to impose his will upon the world, but rather to discover what wanted to emerge from the intersection of his trained skills and his openness to surprise. This period of creative flowering coincided with a gradual shift in how others perceived him. While his reputation as a duelist continued to grow, he also became known as someone who carried within himself a quality of peaceful depth that seemed to transform every interaction, however brief, into something memorable and meaningful. People began to seek him out not just for martial instruction,
but for the kind of quiet wisdom that seemed to radiate from his very presence.
As word of Musashi's unique approach to both combat and life continued to spread along the network of roads and waterways that connected Japan's scattered communities, something began to happen that he had neither sought nor expected. His name started to acquire a kind of gravitational pull, drawing to him not just fellow martial artists seeking instruction or challenge, but also philosophers, artists, and seekers of various kinds who sensed that he might possess answers to questions they were only beginning to formulate. This growing attention brought with it both opportunities and burdens that Musashi had not anticipated during his earlier years of simple wandering. Villages that had once been anonymous stopping points along his journey now became destinations where people awaited his arrival with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Innkeepers would prepare their finest rooms in hopes of hosting the famous Ronin, and local dignitaries would compete for the honor of inviting him to evening meals that seemed to stretch on forever with elaborate ceremonies and formal speeches. While Musashi appreciated the generosity of these gestures, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the role of celebrity that others seemed determined to thrust upon him. The quiet simplicity that had always characterized his travels was being replaced by a kind of performance, where his every word and action were scrutinized for deeper meaning, and his most casual observations were repeated as profound wisdom. More troubling still were the young swordsmen who began to seek him out with a desperate hunger in their eyes, students who seemed to believe that proximity to his legendary skill could somehow transform them overnight into master warriors. They would follow him along mountain paths, peppering him with questions about secret techniques and ultimate strategies, seemingly unable to understand that the very desperation of their seeking was preventing them from receiving what they claimed to want. It was during this period that Musashi began to develop a deeper appreciation for the value of solitude, not as an escape from others, but as a necessary condition for maintaining his connection to the source of whatever wisdom he had managed to cultivate. He started to seek out increasingly remote locations for his periods of rest and reflection. High mountain valleys where the only visitors were migrating birds. Hidden caves where he could sit in meditation for days at a time without interruption. Forest clearings so far from human habitation that the sounds of civilization became nothing more than a distant memory. In these places of deep quiet, away from the expectations and projections of others, Musashi could return to the essential questions that had always guided his journey. What was the true nature of strength? How could one live with complete authenticity while still maintaining compassion for others? What did it mean to achieve mastery without becoming trapped by the limitations of one's own expertise? These questions led him to experiment with deliberate periods of withdrawal from his public role as a famous swordsman. Sometimes he would spend entire months in retreat, living as simply as possible, practicing his art not for any external purpose, but purely for the joy and discipline of continued refinement. During these retreats, he would often fast for extended periods, discovering how the clarification of his physical being seemed to create corresponding clarifications in his mental and spiritual understanding. His artistic work deepened significantly during these periods of intensive solitude. Free from any need to explain or demonstrate his insights to others, he could explore whatever captured his attention with complete freedom and patience. Some of his most beautiful paintings emerged from these retreats, landscapes that seemed to capture not just the visual appearance of their subjects, but something of the profound stillness and patience that characterized the natural world when no human observers were present to disturb it. He also began work during this period on what would eventually become his most famous written work, a systematic exploration of the principles that had emerged from his years of experience with both martial arts and life itself. But unlike the formal treatises produced by other masters of his era, Musashi's writing maintained the same quality of practical directness that characterized everything else about his approach to existence. Each principle he articulated had been tested not just in the controlled environment of a dojo, but in the unpredictable circumstances of real conflicts with genuine consequences. Each insight had been earned through years of patient observation and practice, refined through countless encounters with opponents, students, and fellow travelers, and distilled into its essential form through long hours of quiet contemplation.
The emerging manuscript reflected this experiential grounding in its tone and structure. Rather than abstract philosophical speculation, it offered concrete guidance that could be applied immediately by anyone willing to do the patient work of actual practice. Among the many encounters that shaped Musashi's understanding during his years of wandering, there were a few that seemed to resonate with special significance. Moments when the meeting of two skilled individuals created something larger than either could have achieved alone. These encounters had a quality of mutual recognition, as if two masters of different aspects of the same fundamental art were discovering unexpected connections between their respective paths. One such encounter occurred during a particularly beautiful autumn, when the maple leaves were creating cascades of red and gold that seemed to set entire mountainsides on fire with color. Musashi had been traveling through a region known for its many temples and monasteries, following winding paths that led through groves of ancient trees and past meditation gardens where monks had been tending the same carefully arranged stones and raked sand for generations. At one of these temples, he met an elderly master whose specialty was not swordsmanship, but the art of tea ceremony. This might seem like an unlikely connection, but as their conversation deepened over several days of shared meals and quiet walks through the temple grounds, both men began to recognize profound similarities between their respective disciplines. The tea master spoke of the importance of perfect timing in the ritual preparation and serving of tea, how each gesture must flow naturally into the next, how the temperature of the water and the quality of attention brought to each step could transform a simple drink into something approaching spiritual communion. Musashi found himself nodding in recognition as he listened, seeing clear parallels to the way timing and attention functioned in sword work. In return, he shared his own insights about the importance of maintaining what he called empty mind during combat, a state of receptive awareness that could respond instantly to changing circumstances without being hindered by predetermined plans or expectations. The tea master smiled as he heard this, recognizing the same quality of present moment awareness that was essential to his own practice. Their most meaningful exchange occurred during a tea ceremony that the master conducted specifically for Musashi one misty morning, when the garden was still heavy with dew. As they sat together in the simple tea house, surrounded by the gentle sounds of water and wind, both men experienced a kind of wordless understanding that transcended the boundaries of their individual arts. In that moment, the careful preparation of tea and the refined execution of sword techniques revealed themselves as different expressions of the same fundamental principle, the cultivation of perfect presence and attention. Another significant encounter occurred several years later when Musashi's travels brought him into contact with a master archer whose reputation for accuracy was legendary throughout several provinces. Unlike their initial meeting, which had been arranged as a formal demonstration, their relationship developed gradually over the course of several weeks, during which they found themselves staying in the same mountain village while winter storms made further travel inadvisable. The archer, whose name was Yamamoto, had devoted his entire life to the exploration of a single question: how could the release of an arrow become so natural and effortless that the archer, the bow, and the target ceased to exist as separate entities, leaving only the pure act of hitting the mark? This question fascinated Musashi, who recognized its similarity to his own investigation into the moment when swordsman, sword, and opponent dissolved into a single movement. They spent countless hours during those winter weeks sharing their respective discoveries about the paradoxical relationship between intense preparation and complete letting go. The archer described how years of rigorous technical training eventually gave way to moments of such perfect naturalness that the arrow seemed to release itself without any conscious intention on the archer's part. Musashi shared his own experiences of similar moments in sword work, when his body would move with such fluid intelligence that he seemed to become a mere observer of his own perfect technique. What made these conversations particularly valuable was the way they illuminated aspects of mastery that might remain invisible when explored within the boundaries of a single art. By comparing their experiences across different disciplines, both men gained insights that enriched their understanding of their own specialties, while revealing the universal principles that seem to underlie all forms of genuine mastery. The archer's influence on Musashi's development can be seen in the increased emphasis on what he began to call natural action, movement that arose spontaneously from perfect preparation rather than conscious control. This understanding would later become one of the central themes of his written teachings, influencing generations of students who sought to understand how intense training could paradoxically lead to states of effortless spontaneity. These encounters with masters of other arts reminded Musashi that his own path, however solitary it sometimes seemed, was part of a larger community of seekers who were exploring the same fundamental questions through different means. This recognition brought a quality of humility and perspective to his understanding that would prove invaluable during the more challenging phases of his development that lay ahead.
There comes a moment in every master's journey when the path leads inexorably toward a confrontation that will test everything they have learned, not just about their art, but about themselves. For Musashi, this moment arrived with the gradual emergence of stories about another swordsman whose reputation seemed to mirror his own in almost every detail, creating a kind of inevitable gravitational pull that would eventually bring them together. Sasaki Kojito was not just another skilled fighter seeking to make his mark in the world. Like Musashi himself, he had transcended the ordinary boundaries of technique to develop something uniquely his own, a sword style so fluid and natural that observers compared it to the flight of swallows, capable of changing direction with impossible grace and striking with the sudden, definitive precision of a bird catching insects in midair. The first mentions of Kojito's name reached Musashi during a peaceful spring evening when he was sharing a meal with fellow travelers at a small roadside inn. The conversation had turned, as it often did among wandering swordsmen, to stories of exceptional masters they had heard about or occasionally encountered during their journeys. Someone mentioned a man whose sword was so extraordinarily long that it had been nicknamed the drying pole, and whose technique was said to be so refined that he could cut a swallow's wings without harming its body. As Musashi listened to these descriptions, he felt something stir within him that he hadn't experienced in years. Not excitement, exactly, and certainly not the crude hunger for victory that motivated less developed fighters, but rather a quality of deep recognition, as if he were hearing about his own reflection in a distant mirror. Here, perhaps, was someone who had walked a similar path of dedicated refinement, someone who might understand the loneliness of mastery and the constant hunger for challenges worthy of one's developed capabilities. Over the months that followed, as Musashi continued his wandering through various provinces, Kojito's name seemed to appear with increasing frequency in conversations. Fellow martial artists would speak of having witnessed demonstrations of his technique, always with a quality of awed respect that Musashi recognized from similar discussions of his own abilities. Gradually, the understanding began to form that Japan had produced two swordsmen whose skills had evolved beyond the ordinary categories of comparison, and that sooner or later, the natural order of things would bring them face to face. This recognition brought with it a complex mixture of emotions that Musashi found both fascinating and disturbing to explore. There was anticipation, certainly, the prospect of finally encountering someone who might provide the kind of meaningful challenge he had been unconsciously seeking for years. But there was also something darker and more troubling, a kind of existential vertigo that arose from contemplating what it would mean to face someone whose abilities might actually exceed his own. During this period, his meditation practice deepened considerably as he found himself drawn to explore the psychological territory that surrounded the possibility of defeat. Not defeat in the crude sense of physical injury or public humiliation,
but defeat in the deeper sense of discovering that his entire understanding of his own capabilities and his place in the world might be fundamentally flawed. These explorations led him into some of the most challenging terrain of self-examination he had ever encountered. Late at night, sitting beside dying campfires under star-filled skies, he would follow his awareness into places where all the certainties he had built up over years of successful encounters dissolved into questions. Who was he really, beneath the reputation and the accumulated victories? What would remain of his sense of identity if all of that were suddenly stripped away? Rather than avoiding these uncomfortable questions, Musashi found himself drawn deeper into them with the same determined curiosity he brought to every other aspect of his development. He began to understand that his approaching encounter with Kojiro was not just a test of his martial skills, but an opportunity to discover whether he had developed the kind of inner stability that could remain intact regardless of external outcomes. This realization brought a quality of unexpected peace to his preparations. Instead of frantically practicing techniques or developing new strategies, he found himself spending more and more time in simple stillness, cultivating the kind of profound calm that could serve as a foundation for whatever might be required of him during their eventual meeting. The formal challenge, when it finally came, arrived through the traditional channels, with all the ceremony befitting an encounter between masters of their caliber. A time and place were arranged, the small island of Ganryujima, where they could meet without interference from curious observers or political complications. As Musashi prepared for this ultimate test of everything he had learned during his years of wandering, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if his entire journey had been leading inevitably toward this single, decisive moment.
The morning of the duel dawned with that special quality of light that seems to exist only on the most significant days. Clear, crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape appear etched with supernatural precision. Musashi awoke before sunrise in the small fishing village where he had spent his final night on the mainland, and there was something deeply peaceful about his preparations. He had carved his wooden sword during the boat journey to Ganryu Island, working with the same meditative concentration he brought to his brush paintings. The ore he transformed felt perfectly balanced in his hands, as if it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment of transformation. The wood was still damp with salt spray, carrying the scent of the sea and something indefinable, perhaps the weight of destiny itself. As his boat approached the small island, Musashi could see Sasaki Kojiro already waiting on the beach. Even from a distance, the man cut an impressive figure. Tall, elegant, his famous long sword glinting in the morning light like captured lightning. Kojiro stood with the perfect posture of someone who had never doubted his own supremacy, never questioned that the world would bend to accommodate his skill and certainty. But Musashi had learned something profound during his years of wandering. True strength often appeared in forms that the world didn't recognize or expect. As he stepped onto the beach, still holding his crude wooden sword, he felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, of awareness expanding to encompass every detail of the moment. The sound of waves against the shore, the salt tang in the air, the way morning light played across the water. Kojiro's reaction to his opponent's unconventional appearance was immediate and telling. The slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance, these were the tiny tells that Musashi had learned to read like written words. His opponent was already off balance, already fighting ghosts of expectation and assumption rather than the reality standing before him. The actual encounter lasted only moments,
But within those moments lay the distillation of everything Musashi had learned during his years of patient development. His movement was not aggressive or spectacular, but rather possessed a quality of natural inevitability, like water finding its level or a stone falling toward earth. The wooden sword moved through the air with perfect efficiency, and when it connected, the sound echoed across the water with a finality that seemed to still even the wind. Kojiro fell not with drama or struggle, but with the quiet completeness of a candle being extinguished. As Musashi stood over his fallen opponent, watching the life fade from eyes that had held such fierce certainty only moments before, he felt something shift deep within himself. This victory was different from all the others, not because it was more difficult, but because it felt like the end of something essential. The witnesses stood in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they had seen. Some had expected a lengthy, technical display of the highest levels of swordsmanship. Others had perhaps hoped for the dramatic downfall of the wild Ronin who had dared to challenge their appointed champion. Instead, they had witnessed something that felt almost anticlimactic in its swiftness and certainty. As Musashi turned away from Kojiro's still form and walked back toward his waiting boat, he carried with him the knowledge that he had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He was no longer a warrior seeking worthy opponents or challenges that might test his developing skills. He had become something else entirely, something for which there was perhaps no adequate name. The boat ride back to the mainland passed in contemplative silence. The boatman, wise enough to recognize that he was in the presence of something beyond ordinary human experience, rowed steadily without attempting conversation. Behind them, Ganryu Island grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon, but Musashi knew that what had happened there would echo through the years in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. That evening, as he sat alone beside a small fire on a deserted stretch of beach, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Musashi began to understand that his real journey was just beginning. The external battles that had shaped his youth and early manhood had been preparation for something far more challenging and profound: the long, solitary work of understanding what it truly meant to master not just technique, but oneself. In the days that followed his encounter with Kojiro, Musashi found himself experiencing a kind of emotional weather that he had never encountered before. Victory had always brought him a sense of completion, a feeling that another piece of the great puzzle of his development had clicked into place. But this victory felt different, heavier, more complex, tinged with something that might have been melancholy if he had been someone else. As word of the duel spread across the provinces, carried by merchants and traveling monks and the endless network of gossips who seemed to exist solely to transport news from one community to another, Musashi discovered that he was no longer simply famous. He had crossed some invisible boundary into the realm of legend, and with that transformation came a kind of isolation he had not anticipated. People began to look at him differently when he entered villages or stopped at roadside inns. Where once there had been curiosity or respectful caution, now there was something approaching awe, and not the comfortable kind that comes from admiring exceptional skill, but the uncomfortable kind reserved for forces of nature or phenomena that exist beyond ordinary human categories. Children no longer ran up to him with bright eyes and endless questions about swordsmanship and adventure. Instead, they watched him from safe distances, whispering among themselves like small birds observing a hawk. Adults who might once have invited him to share their evening meals now found excuses to be elsewhere when he appeared, leaving him to eat alone more often than not. This growing separation from ordinary human contact might have driven another person toward bitterness or cynicism, but Musashi found himself responding to it with a kind of philosophical curiosity. What did it mean to have achieved something that placed you beyond the normal boundaries of human fellowship? Was this the natural price of absolute mastery? Or had he somehow taken a wrong turn on the path he had been following for so many years? During this period of reflection, he began to spend more time in environments where human society had no presence at all. Deep forests where the only sounds were wind through ancient trees and the distant calls of birds. Mountain meadows where he could sit for hours watching clouds cast moving shadows across the grass. Remote valleys where streams ran clear and cold between stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of patient water. In these places of natural solitude, away from the weight of reputation and expectation, Musashi found that he could still connect with the simple joy that had first drawn him to the martial arts as a young boy. He would practice his forms with the same careful attention he had always brought to training, but now there was something different in his movements, a quality of completion, as if he were no longer developing technique, but rather celebrating it. His artistic pursuits deepened considerably during this period. The paintings he created in remote locations had a quality of stillness and space that seemed to capture not just the visual appearance of their subjects, but something of their essential spirit. A single bird perched on a branch became a meditation on solitude and alertness. A view across a mountain valley seemed to contain entire philosophies of distance and perspective. He began writing more regularly as well, not with any intention of creating formal teachings, but simply as a way of processing the complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that seemed to define his current state of being. These early writings were fragmentary and personal, more like conversations with himself than attempts to communicate with others. Gradually, as the seasons turned and his solitary wanderings continued, Musashi began to understand that what he was experiencing was not depression or disappointment, but rather a natural transition from one phase of development to another. The external challenges that had shaped his youth and early manhood had served their purpose. Now it was time for something else, something that would require different kinds of courage and different forms of persistence. He realized that he was approaching a choice that every master eventually faces, whether to remain content with what has already been achieved or to venture into the more mysterious and demanding territory of understanding why achievement matters at all. The first option offered the comfort of certainty and the pleasure of continued recognition. The second promised nothing, except the opportunity to discover what lay beyond mastery itself. As autumn began to paint the mountain slopes in colors so beautiful they seemed almost like music made visible, Musashi found himself gravitating toward increasingly remote locations, seeking not just physical solitude, but the kind of deep silence that allows a person to hear the subtler voices of their own spirit. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of profound stillness that seems to settle over the world like a gentle blessing. Snow muffled the familiar sounds of the countryside, creating a landscape so peaceful and unified that walking through it felt almost like moving through a meditation made manifest in white and silver and the deep green of evergreen trees heavy with their seasonal burden. Musashi found himself drawn to a small temple complex nestled high in the mountains, not because he sought formal religious instruction, but because the monks who lived there had cultivated something he was beginning to recognize as essential to his own development: the ability to find profound meaning in the simplest activities. Watching them tend their gardens, prepare their meals, and maintain their buildings with the same careful attention others might reserve for the most important ceremonies taught him something new about the nature of mastery itself. The head monk, an elderly man whose face seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of decades spent in quiet observation, welcomed Musashi without ceremony or special recognition of his reputation. This simple acceptance felt like a gift more valuable than gold. For the first time in months, he could simply be present without carrying the weight of legend or the burden of others' expectations. During the long winter evenings, as snow continued to fall outside the temple's warm common room, Musashi engaged in conversations that ranged across topics he had never explored with such depth. Philosophy, poetry, the relationship between action and contemplation, the question of what it means to live a meaningful life. These discussions unfolded with the same natural flow as good music, each participant contributing according to their understanding while remaining open to new insights. One conversation in particular stayed with him long after the winter snows had melted. The old monk had asked him a simple question: "What do you do with a sword that has become so sharp it can cut anything?" At first, Musashi had assumed this was a riddle about technique or strategy, but as they continued talking through the night, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals, he began to understand that the question was about something much more fundamental. A sword that could cut anything, the monk suggested, might eventually discover that cutting was not the most interesting thing it could do. Perhaps such a blade would be curious about what lay beyond cutting, about the space between things, about the stillness that exists before movement begins, about the peace that follows when all possible conflicts have been resolved not through victory, but through understanding. This insight opened doorways in Musashi's thinking that he hadn't known existed. He began to see his own development not as a linear progression toward greater and greater fighting ability, but as a spiral path that was gradually leading him toward questions that transcended martial arts altogether. What was the relationship between individual excellence and service to something larger? How could one use supreme skill in ways that created rather than destroyed? What would it look like to be a master whose greatest achievement was helping others discover their own mastery? As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it the sound of running water and the first tentative green shoots pushing up through the snow, Musashi found himself preparing to leave the temple community that had given him so much during the quiet winter months. But he was not returning to his old life of wandering from challenge to challenge. Instead, he felt called towards something that he could not yet name clearly, a way of being in the world that would honor everything he had learned while opening him to forms of service and understanding he had never previously imagined. The monks gathered to bid him farewell on a morning when the air was so clear and sweet it seemed to sparkle with invisible music. There were no formal ceremonies or elaborate speeches, just simple expressions of gratitude and wishes for safe travels. But as Musashi walked down the mountain path, carrying his few possessions and feeling somehow lighter than he had in years, he knew that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship to his own life and purpose. The path ahead was unclear in terms of specific destinations or goals, but it felt right in a way that transcended ordinary certainty. He was no longer a warrior seeking opponents, or even a master seeking students. He was becoming something else entirely, a human being who had developed exceptional capabilities and was now ready to discover what those capabilities were truly for. Behind him, the temple bells rang the hour with their familiar bronze voices, and ahead of him, the path wound down toward the ordinary world where ordinary people lived their ordinary lives, each carrying their own hidden potential for extraordinary transformation.
The months that followed Musashi's departure from the mountain temple became a period of the most creative flowering he had ever experienced. Free from the constant pressure of maintaining his reputation as an unbeatable swordsman, he found himself able to approach artistic pursuits with the same total commitment and attention to detail that had characterized his martial development. But this was not simply a matter of changing from one activity to another. Instead, he began to discover profound connections between the disciplines he had previously thought of as separate. The same quality of presence and timing that made sword work effective proved equally essential in calligraphy, where each brushstroke required perfect coordination between intention and execution.
The spatial awareness that had kept him alive in countless duels translated beautifully into painting, helping him understand how to use empty space as skillfully as filled areas. He established a small studio in a quiet valley where a clear stream provided both the water he needed for ink preparation and the gentle background music of flowing water that seemed to enhance his concentration. His daily routine settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Morning meditation, followed by physical practice with sword forms, afternoon sessions devoted to painting or calligraphy, evenings spent in study or quiet reflection. The paintings that emerged from this period had a quality unlike anything he had produced before. Where his earlier work had been technically competent but somewhat conventional, these new pieces seemed to capture something essential about their subjects that went beyond mere visual representation. A simple bamboo stalk bent by wind became a study in resilience and flexibility. A mountain peak emerging from morning clouds suggested the relationship between striving and acceptance. A small bird sitting perfectly still on a branch seemed to embody the alert tranquility that Musashi was learning to cultivate in his own life. Word of his artistic activities began to spread among the communities of painters, calligraphers, and poetry lovers who formed an informal network throughout the region. Unlike his military reputation, which had intimidated as many people as it impressed, his growing recognition as an artist seemed to invite connection and conversation. Fellow practitioners would seek him out not to challenge or test him, but to share insights about technique, discuss aesthetic philosophy, or simply enjoy the company of someone who understood the particular joys and frustrations of creative work. These interactions reminded Musashi of something he had nearly forgotten during his years of solitary wandering: the pleasure of genuine collaboration with peers who shared his interests and could appreciate his efforts without being overshadowed by fear or excessive reverence. In conversations with other artists, he was neither the legendary swordsman whose very presence changed the energy of a room, nor the isolated master who had transcended ordinary human concerns. He was simply someone with exceptional skills and deep curiosity about how those skills might be developed and applied. Through these relationships, he began to understand that mastery was not a solitary achievement, but rather something that flowered most fully in community with others who were pursuing their own forms of excellence. The tea master, who could orchestrate an entire ceremony with flawless grace, had insights about timing and attention that enriched Musashi's understanding of sword work. The poet, who could capture complex emotions in 17 syllables, taught him about the power of economy and suggestion. The potter, whose vessels seemed to embody perfect balance, showed him new ways of thinking about harmony and proportion. As his artistic skills continued to develop, Musashi began to notice that his relationship to swordsmanship was also evolving. When he practiced his forms now, there was less emphasis on maintaining techniques that might be useful in combat and more attention to the pure movement itself, the way energy flowed through his body, the relationship between stillness and motion, the moment-to-moment quality of awareness that made each gesture feel alive and spontaneous. He realized that he was approaching something that the old masters had sometimes called artless art, a state where technique became so deeply integrated that it disappeared, leaving only natural, spontaneous response to whatever each moment required. This was not a regression from mastery, but rather its culmination, the point where all the years of disciplined training transformed into something that looked and felt like effortless play. During this period, he also began to write more systematically about his understanding of strategy, combat psychology, and the relationship between martial arts and other forms of human development. But these writings had a different quality from the technical manuals produced by other sword masters. They were more philosophical, more concerned with underlying principles than specific techniques, more interested in questions than definitive answers.
As another winter approached, bringing with it the familiar invitation to deeper contemplation and withdrawal from external activity, Musashi felt drawn to an even more remote location than he had ever chosen before. High in the mountains, far from any human settlement, stood a simple cave that seemed to call to him with the same quiet insistence that had guided many of his most important decisions. The cave itself was unremarkable, just a natural shelter carved by wind and water from the living rock of the mountain. But its position offered something precious: complete solitude and a view across valleys and peaks that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Here, he thought, he could finally undertake the kind of deep investigation that his recent experiences had been preparing him for. He arrived as the first snows were beginning to dust the higher elevations, carrying with him only the most essential supplies: warm clothing, basic cooking equipment, writing materials, and of course his swords, though he suspected they would serve more as companions than tools during the months ahead. The physical challenges of establishing himself in such an austere environment were considerable, but they felt more like opportunities than hardships, chances to test his self-reliance and discover what was truly necessary for sustaining both body and spirit. The rhythm of days in the cave developed organically around the natural cycles of light and weather. Dawn came slowly to the high mountains, creeping across the landscape with a gradual illumination that made each sunrise feel like a gentle awakening rather than an abrupt transition from night to day. These extended periods of dawn light became perfect times for meditation, when the world seemed balanced on the edge between sleep and waking, offering glimpses of the peaceful clarity that existed before the mind became busy with plans and concerns. During the deepest part of winter, when snow blocked the paths leading down from his retreat, and the only sounds were wind through stone and the occasional call of a hardy mountain bird, Musashi entered into levels of silence and solitude that he had never experienced before. At first, this was difficult. His mind, accustomed to the constant stimulation of travel and human interaction, seemed to rebel against the enforced quietude. Thoughts arose like persistent visitors, demanding attention and response. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, and the silence deepened around him like a comfortable blanket, something shifted in his relationship to his own mental activity. The thoughts continued to arise, but he no longer felt compelled to engage with each one or follow wherever it wanted to lead him. They became more like clouds passing through an empty sky, present but not permanent, noticeable but not dominating. In this space of inner quietude, insights began to emerge that had nothing to do with swordsmanship or strategy in any conventional sense. He began to understand that all his years of training and all his victories and all his artistic achievements had been preparing him for something much simpler and more fundamental: the ability to be completely present with whatever life offered without the need to change it or improve it or even understand it completely. The sword work he practiced during this period became increasingly abstract, more like moving meditation than preparation for combat. Sometimes he would spend entire afternoons exploring a single transition between two positions, not to perfect it in any technical sense, but to discover what that particular movement could teach him about balance, timing, and the relationship between effort and effortlessness. His writing during this period took on a similar quality of depth and simplicity. Instead of trying to catalog techniques or analyze strategies, he found himself exploring fundamental questions about the nature of conflict and resolution,
about what it means to be truly prepared for whatever life might present. The pages that accumulated through the long winter months read less like a martial arts manual and more like a philosophical investigation into the deepest questions of human existence. A spring began to stir in the valleys below his mountain retreat, bringing with it the sound of running water and the first signs of returning life. Musashi realized that his time in the cave had accomplished something he hadn't expected. He was no longer driven by the restless energy that had characterized most of his adult life. The constant sense of being on a journey towards some distant goal had been replaced by a feeling of having arrived at something that was both destination and starting point. He understood now that mastery was not something you achieved and then possessed, but rather a way of being present with whatever arose, moment by moment, with complete availability and responsiveness. The sword had been his teacher, but the real lesson had always been about life itself.
As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Musashi settled more deeply into the rhythms of his mountain solitude, he began to feel a growing sense that his years of learning and experience were calling him toward a particular form of expression. The scattered writings that had accumulated during his retreat began to organize themselves in his mind around certain fundamental principles and insights that seemed to apply not just to swordsmanship, but to any serious engagement with the challenges of existence. The decision to write what would become his most famous work arose naturally from this growing clarity. He had reached a point in his development where the knowledge he had gained seemed to be asking for a more systematic and complete expression, not as an ego-driven attempt to cement his reputation, but as a form of service to future generations of seekers who might find value in his hard-won understanding. Working by the light of oil lamps during the long winter evenings, with the cave walls holding the warmth of a small fire and the silence of the mountains wrapping around him like a protective embrace, Musashi began to organize his insights into what he conceived as 5 fundamental approaches to mastery. Each approach would be associated with one of the classical elements, providing a framework that was both practical and symbolic. The Earth Book would address the foundations of any serious practice, the basic principles and attitudes that must be cultivated before specific techniques could be meaningfully developed. Like the Earth itself, these foundations needed to be solid, stable, and capable of supporting whatever might be built upon them. Here he wrote about the importance of understanding one's own motivations, about the difference between true and false confidence, about the patient work of building skills that would remain reliable under pressure. The Water Book explored the principle of adaptability that had been so central to his own development. Water always finds its level, always adapts to the shape of its container, yet maintains its essential nature regardless of circumstances. This section dealt with the mental and emotional flexibility required to respond effectively to changing situations, the ability to remain fluid while maintaining one's center, the skill of turning obstacles into opportunities. In the Fire Book, he addressed the dynamic aspects of any challenging encounter: timing, rhythm, the ability to recognize and seize the decisive moment. Fire was immediate, transformative, capable of providing both light and destruction depending on how it was applied. Here he explored the psychology of conflict, the importance of reading opponents correctly, the way decisive action could transform entire situations in an instant. The Vin Book took a different approach, examining the various schools and traditions that existed in his field and analyzing their strengths and limitations. Like wind, these influences were everywhere and affected everything, but they could also be understood and worked with rather than simply accepted blindly. This section represented his most systematic attempt to place his own approach within the broader context of martial arts philosophy. Finally,
The Void Book addressed the most subtle and perhaps most important aspect of mastery, the space of pure awareness from which all skillful action arose. The void was not emptiness in a negative sense, but rather the pregnant space of pure potential that existed before thought and action, the source from which genuine spontaneity emerged. This was perhaps the most difficult section to write, dealing as it did with experiences that by their very nature transcended ordinary categories of description. As he worked on these 5 books through the changing seasons, Musashi found that the process of writing itself was a form of meditation and discovery. Often he would begin a section thinking he understood his subject clearly, only to find that the attempt to express his understanding in words revealed layers of complexity and nuance he hadn't noticed previously. The discipline of writing forced him to examine his own insights with greater rigor and precision than ever before. He wrote plainly, without literary flourishes or attempts to impress readers with his erudition. His goal was communication rather than demonstration, understanding rather than admiration. Every sentence was tested against his actual experience, every principle verified through memory of real encounters and genuine challenges. If something sounded impressive but couldn't be applied practically, he discarded it. If a truth seemed simple to the point of obviousness but had taken him years to learn, he included it without embarrassment. The work grew slowly, organically, like a tree adding ring after ring of growth. Each section built upon and illuminated the others, creating a unified vision of what serious practice could accomplish and what it required.
When Musashi finally completed his great work, setting down his brush after writing the last character of the Void Book, he felt this sense of completion unlike anything he had experienced after any of his famous victories. This was not the satisfaction of having defeated an opponent or proven his superiority, but something deeper and more lasting, the quiet fulfillment that comes from having given faithful expression to one's deepest understanding. The manuscript lay before him in the flickering light of his oil lamp, hundreds of pages covered with careful calligraphy that represented years of concentrated thought and reflection. But even as he looked at this tangible result of his labor, Musashi knew that the real significance of the work lay not in the pages themselves, but in what the process of creating them had accomplished within him. Writing the book had been his final and most demanding teacher, forcing him to examine every assumption and test every insight against the touchstone of actual experience. As spring returned to the mountains and the snow began its gradual retreat from the lower elevations, Musashi found himself thinking more and more about the world beyond his cave retreat. His time in solitude had been necessary and fruitful, but he sensed that it was approaching its natural conclusion. The insights he had gained and the understanding he had developed were calling him toward some form of active expression in the world. But this return to engagement with others would be different from anything in his previous experience. He was no longer the young warrior seeking challenges and opportunities to test himself, nor the mature master pursuing the perfect understanding of his art. He had become something new, a person who had achieved exceptional skill and then discovered what lay beyond achievement. His relationship to his abilities had been fundamentally transformed. When he practiced sword forms now, during the early morning hours as dawn crept across the mountain peaks, there was something almost playful about his movements. Not playful in a casual or careless sense, but with the kind of relaxed mastery that comes when technique has been so thoroughly absorbed that it can be expressed with complete naturalness. Every gesture flowed from a place of deep centeredness, and every transition between positions felt inevitable and harmonious. The few travelers who encountered him during his gradual return to more populated areas often remarked later about the quality of presence he seemed to carry, There was something about being in his company that made ordinary conversations feel more meaningful, that brought a quality of attention and care to even casual interactions. He seemed to be listening not just to words, but to something deeper, the genuine human being speaking through whatever roles and pretenses the situation might require. When younger martial artists sought him out for instruction, as they inevitably did once word of his presence spread, they often found themselves puzzled by his approach to teaching. Instead of beginning with techniques or strategies, he would ask them questions about their lives, their motivations, their understanding of what they hoped to accomplish through training. He seemed more interested in who they were becoming as people than in what they could do with swords. Those students who persevered past their initial confusion discovered that they were receiving an education that extended far beyond martial arts. They were learning about attention, about presence, about the patient work of understanding themselves well enough to respond appropriately to whatever circumstances they encountered. The sword work, when it finally came, emerged naturally from this broader foundation like flowers blooming from well-tended soil. Musashi's reputation during this later period was different from the legendary status he had achieved through his undefeated record in formal duels. He became known as someone who had transcended the limitations of even the highest levels of technical mastery to discover something that could only be called wisdom. People sought him out not just for martial arts instruction, but for guidance about life itself. How to find meaning in ordinary activities, how to maintain equanimity in difficult circumstances, how to cultivate the kind of inner stability that could weather any external storm. Yet even as his influence grew and his teachings began to spread throughout Japan and eventually far beyond its borders, Musashi remained fundamentally unchanged by fame or recognition. He continued to live simply, to find joy in basic activities like preparing meals and maintaining his equipment, to approach each day with the same quality of fresh attention that had characterized his practice since youth. He had discovered something that few people in any generation managed to find, a way of being in the world that was simultaneously completely engaged and completely free, totally committed to excellence and totally at peace with whatever outcomes that commitment might produce.
As the years continued to pass with their familiar rhythm of seasons, Musashi noticed subtle changes beginning to occur in his relationship with his own body and energy. It was not dramatic or sudden, more like the way autumn gradually transforms the color of leaves, so slowly that you might not notice the change from day to day, but so completely that looking back, the transformation seems miraculous. His morning practice sessions took on a different quality during this period, where once he had pushed himself to maintain the highest levels of physical intensity and technical precision, he now found himself drawn toward a gentler exploration of movement and breath. This was not surrender to physical decline, but rather a natural evolution toward forms of practice that honored his accumulated wisdom while acknowledging the changing needs of his aging body. The sword work he practiced now had an almost dancing quality, emphasizing flow and continuity over explosive power. Each form became a meditation on the relationship between movement and stillness, effort and effortlessness. Sometimes he would spend entire sessions exploring tiny variations in timing or breathing, discovering subtleties that had been invisible to him when he was focused on more obvious aspects of technique. His students during this period often commented on the profound sense of peace that seemed to emanate from his practice. Watching him move through sword forms was like observing a master calligrapher creating characters. Each gesture perfect in its own right, yet part of a larger composition that revealed its full beauty only when seen as a complete whole. The teaching that emerged from this more mature phase of his development emphasized principles over techniques, understanding over performance. When students asked him about specific sword cuts or defensive strategies, he would often respond with questions about their breathing, their mental state during practice, their ability to remain centered when facing uncertainty.
He had come to understand that mastery was primarily an internal matter, and that external techniques were merely expressions of internal development. His writing during this period took on an increasingly reflective quality. The journal entries and occasional letters that survive from these years reveal a man who was deeply engaged with questions about the meaning and purpose of a well-lived life. He wrote about the relationship between individual achievement and service to others, about the way true strength revealed itself through gentleness rather than force, about the profound satisfaction that came from helping others discover their own potential for excellence. Perhaps most remarkably, his famous competitive edge seemed to transform into something entirely different, a kind of collaborative spirit that sought to bring out the best in everyone he encountered. When martial artists challenged him during this period, he would often turn the encounter into an impromptu teaching session, using the challenger's own techniques and tendencies as starting points for exploration and learning. Some of these interactions became legendary in their own right, not because of their violence or decisiveness, but because of their unexpected outcomes. A young swordsman who approached Musashi seeking a formal duel might find himself instead engaged in a lengthy conversation about strategy and philosophy, leaving the encounter with insights that proved more valuable than any victory or defeat could have provided. His daily routine during these later years reflected the same integration of practical activity and contemplative depth that had characterized his approach to swordsmanship. Morning meditation naturally flowed into physical practice, which in turn led to periods of artistic work, painting, calligraphy, or writing. Afternoons might be devoted to teaching or conversation with visitors, while evenings were typically reserved for quiet reflection and study. The mountain retreat that had once been a place of intense solitary practice became something more like a pilgrimage destination for serious students of martial arts and philosophy. But unlike the formal schools that attracted students through reputation and rigid curricula, Musashi's approach remained fundamentally informal and personal. Each visitor was met as an individual with unique needs and possibilities, and the instruction they received was tailored specifically to their level of development and their particular questions or challenges.
The final phase of Musashi's life unfolded with the same natural grace that had characterized his most masterful sword techniques: inevitable, complete, and somehow perfectly timed. As his hair whitened and his movements took on the careful deliberation of advanced age, he found himself entering into a relationship with mortality that was both accepting and deeply curious. Death, he realized, was simply the ultimate challenge in a life that had been defined by meeting challenges with presence and skill. But unlike his encounters with human opponents, this final duel could not be won through superior technique or psychological advantage. It could only be met with the same quality of open awareness that he had cultivated through decades of practice and reflection. His preparations for death were characteristically thoughtful and thorough. He spent considerable time organizing his writings and ensuring that his most essential insights would be preserved for future generations. But he also devoted attention to smaller, more personal matters, expressing gratitude to people who had influenced his development, settling any outstanding obligations, and creating a sense of completion around the various relationships and projects that had shaped his later years. The cave that had served as his retreat for so many years became quite naturally the place where he chose to make his final transition. There was something fitting about this. The same space that had witnessed his deepest insights and most important literary work would also witness the culmination of everything he had learned about the art of living fully. As his physical strength gradually diminished, Musashi noticed that his mental clarity seemed to increase proportionally. The approaching boundary of death appeared to concentrate his attention in ways that even the most intense combat situations had never achieved. Every sensation, every breath, every moment of awareness became precious and vivid. His final students, who had the privilege of spending time with him during this period, often spoke later about the extraordinary quality of presence he maintained even as his body grew frail. Conversations with him during his last months had a crystalline clarity, as if all the accumulated wisdom of his lifetime was being distilled into its most essential elements. He continued to practice sword forms until very near the end, though these final sessions bore no resemblance to the rigorous training of his youth. Instead, they were more like moving prayers, expressions of gratitude for the path that had carried him so far and taught him so much. Sometimes he would spend an entire morning exploring a single transition between two positions, not seeking to improve it, but simply to celebrate the profound harmony between intention and action that had taken him a lifetime to understand. His final written work consisted of brief notes and observations that he continued to record almost until his last day. These fragments reveal a mind that remained curious and engaged, even as the body that had housed it was clearly preparing for its final rest. He wrote about the sensation of letting go, about the strange lightness that came from releasing all attachments to outcomes, about the peace that emerged when the long work of self-improvement finally gave way to simple acceptance of what is. On the morning that would prove to be his last, Musashi arose before dawn, as had been his custom for so many years. But instead of beginning his usual routine of meditation and practice, he spent the pre-dawn hours in quiet contemplation, watching the gradual emergence of light across the mountain landscape that had been his companion through so many seasons of change and growth. As the sun rose fully above the eastern peaks, filling his cave with warm golden light, he arranged himself in the formal sitting position that warriors traditionally adopted when preparing to meet death with honor. His swords lay beside him, not as weapons, but as symbols of the path that had brought him to this moment of completion. His final breaths came easily, without struggle or resistance. Those who found him later remarked on the expression of profound peace that remained on his face, as if death had not been an enemy to be fought, but an old friend finally welcomed home. His body was positioned with the same perfect balance that had characterized his sword work, his hands resting gently on his thighs, his spine straight but not rigid. In the silence that followed his passing, it seemed to those present that something more than an individual life had come to its conclusion. An entire approach to the relationship between mastery and wisdom, between achievement and understanding, between the development of individual skill and service to the larger human community, had found its perfect expression and natural completion. And yet, even in death, Musashi's influence continued to radiate outward like ripples spreading across still water.
And so, dear friends, our gentle journey through the life of Miyamoto Musashi draws toward its peaceful close. As we sit together in this quiet moment, perhaps you can feel the same sense of completion that must have settled over those ancient mountains when the great master finally laid down his earthly struggles and joined the eternal flow of seasons and stars. But the most beautiful aspect of Musashi's story is not really its ending. It's the way his insights continue to ripple outward through time, touching the lives of people he never could have imagined. In quiet studios around the world, artists still find inspiration in his paintings, recognizing in those simple brushstrokes the same quality of presence and attention that made his swordsmanship legendary. Students of martial arts discover in his teachings not just techniques for combat, but principles for living with grace and effectiveness in whatever circumstances life presents. Even in our modern world, so different from the Japan of Musashi's time, his fundamental insights remain remarkably relevant. The importance of cultivating inner stillness in the midst of external chaos. The value of patient practice and gradual refinement of one's abilities. The recognition that true strength often expresses itself through gentleness rather than force. The understanding that mastery is not a destination, but a way of traveling through life with awareness and skill. Perhaps you've felt some of these truths stirring in your own experience as we've wandered together through his story. The quiet satisfaction that comes from paying complete attention to simple activities. The sense of centeredness that emerges when we stop trying to control outcomes and focus instead on bringing our best efforts to whatever we're doing. The recognition that our greatest challenges often turn out to be our most valuable teachers. In the silence of this late hour, as you rest in whatever comfortable space you found for our shared journey, you might notice that Musashi's story has become part of your own story now. Not because you need to become a swordsman or seek out dramatic conflicts, but because the principles he discovered through his particular path apply to any sincere attempt to develop our human potential. Whether you're learning to paint watercolors or trying to be more patient with difficult people, whether you're training for athletic competition or simply hoping to bring more awareness to your daily routines, the essential elements remain the same. Patient practice, honest self-observation, the willingness to learn from failure as well as success, the cultivation of inner stability that can respond appropriately to whatever circumstances arise. As the seasons continue their eternal cycle and our individual lives unfold within that larger rhythm, we can remember that mastery is always available to us in whatever form our circumstances require. The business person seeking to develop integrity and effectiveness in their work is walking the same essential path that Musashi walked through his sword practice. The parent learning to respond to challenging situations with wisdom rather than reactivity is cultivating the same quality of centeredness that allowed him to remain calm in life-or-death encounters. The artist exploring new techniques with patience and dedication is engaging in the same process of gradual refinement that transformed a wild young warrior into one of history's most revered masters. Even the simple act of listening deeply to another person involves the same quality of presence and attention that Musashi brought to reading his opponent's intentions. And perhaps most importantly, we can remember that the goal is not to achieve some final state of perfection, but to find meaning and satisfaction in the process of continual learning and growth. Musashi's greatest teaching may be that mastery is not about becoming someone different from who we already are, but about discovering and expressing the full potential that already exists within our ordinary human nature. In the end, his story whispers to us across the centuries with a message both simple and profound. Pay attention, practice with dedication, be present with whatever life offers, trust the process of gradual development. Find ways to serve something larger than your immediate self-interest. And remember that true strength emerges not from the ability to dominate others, but from the capacity to remain centered and responsive regardless of external circumstances. As you settle deeper into rest now, carried by the gentle rhythm of your own breathing and the quiet satisfaction of having shared this peaceful journey together, you might let yourself feel connected to that long line of seekers who have found inspiration in Musashi's example. Students and masters, artists and warriors, philosophers and simple practitioners, all part of the same great conversation about what it means to live a fully human life.
And so, dear friends, our peaceful journey together comes to its gentle close.
like the last notes of a lullaby fading into the quiet of night, or the final brushstroke completing a painting that has been months in the making. There's something both satisfying and wistful about reaching the end of a story that has carried us so far from our starting point. As you rest there in your comfortable space, perhaps pulling your softest blanket a little closer, or adjusting your pillow to find that perfect position for drifting into sleep, I hope you can feel something of what Musashi himself must have experienced in those final moments of his life. A deep sense of completion, not because everything had been achieved, but because the journey itself had been embraced so fully. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight, for lending me your attention and imagination as we explored together the hidden mountains and quiet valleys of one remarkable life. Thank you for staying with the story through all its turns and transformations, from the wild energy of young ambition to the serene wisdom of accomplished mastery. If this gentle exploration has brought you some measure of peace or inspiration, if it has helped you find that drowsy state where the concerns of the day begin to release their hold and the promise of restful sleep beckons like a distant lighthouse guiding ships safely to harbor, then our time together has accomplished everything I could have hoped for. Please remember to subscribe to join our growing community of peaceful listeners, fellow travelers who seek rest and restoration through the sharing of stories that remind us of our best possibilities. A gentle like would mean more to me than I can express, and if you have suggestions for future journeys we might take together, other lives to explore, other wisdoms to discover in the quiet hours when the world settles into rest, please share them in the comments below. Perhaps tomorrow, you'll wake with some small piece of Musashi's understanding still glowing quietly in your heart. Maybe it will be his recognition that true strength grows from stillness, or his insight that mastery is found not in conquering others, but in the patient work of understanding ourselves. Possibly, you'll carry with him his discovery that art and discipline can be the same activity approached with different names, or his realization that the most important victories are the ones that create peace rather than further conflict. Whatever you remember, whether it's a specific insight or simply the feeling of having spent time in the company of someone who dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of excellence and understanding, let it be a gentle companion as you move through your own days and challenges. Let it remind you that every ordinary moment contains opportunities for presence and awareness, that every difficult situation offers chances to practice the kind of centered responsiveness that Musashi spent a lifetime developing. As sleep begins to call to you now, like a familiar friend extending a warm invitation to rest and restoration, you might let your breathing settle into its most natural rhythm. Feel your body relaxing more completely with each exhale, releasing the day's tensions and concerns into the darkness that surrounds and supports you. In that growing quietude, you might sense something of the same peace that settled over those ancient mountains when Musashi completed his final teaching and prepared for his ultimate journey. Not the peace of endings, but the deeper peace that comes from having lived fully, from having given our best efforts to the work we were called to do, from having contributed our own unique voice to the great conversation of human experience. The story we've shared tonight will continue its own journey now, rippling outward into dreams and quiet contemplations, into the deep restorative processes that happen while we sleep, into the subtle ways that meaningful stories change us from the inside out. And somewhere in that mysterious space between waking and sleeping, you might feel yourself connected to all the other listeners who have found comfort and inspiration in tales of people who chose difficult paths in service of beautiful goals. Until we meet again in another story, on another peaceful evening when you seek the gentle companionship of shared exploration and quiet wonder, sleep well, rest peacefully, and wake tomorrow with a heart a little more spacious than it was today. The mountains are still there in the darkness, patient and enduring. The streams still follow their ancient courses toward the sea. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, the spirit of mastery continues its eternal dance, available to anyone willing to listen deeply enough to hear its quiet invitation. Good night, dear friends. Good night.